So I've dropped probably close to 8 to 10 hours into Oshur on the live server this past weekend, cataloguing the majority of that time spent on the live streams that we ran as well, so big shout out to all of those who came by and supported those streams. But today is all about working through that experience, discussing what works, what doesn't, and whether or not any of it comes down to personal preference. Let's talk. G'day there once again viewers, your mate Kamikaze78 here, and let's talk about the Oshur experience as of launch. So, I gotta be real guys, streaming this weekend and primarily talking about Oshur the whole time has made one thing incredibly clear to me. The reception behind this continent is polarizing. That is the best way I can describe it. I've seen infantry players love it and hate it. I've seen vehicle players love it and hate it. I've seen outfit leaders and squad leaders love it and hate it. And I'm also curious to see how these sentiments continue as the honeymoon period wears off with Oshur. Because let's be honest here, every new and shiny update that comes to the game always has that honeymoon period where everyone wants to try out the new and shiny things before they either become metafied or things just become boring. We saw it for a while with the escalation update and the Bastion fleet carriers, for example. You know, big air battles became a staple for the game for a good amount of time there until that style of play started falling by the wayside for the main objective again. I mean, hell, I know players who now view Bastion fleet carriers as pains in the arses nowadays. For the Shattered Warp Gate update, we saw combat in that northeastern section of the new Esamir continent for a while because that kind of experience was fresh and new until, well, that experience became stale. So these honeymoon periods exist, and there is no question in my mind that that's the case for Oshur as it stands right now. It's new and shiny, which for a game that's been around for 9 years, when we get something new and shiny, it kind of means a lot. But I know for some, the continent is already wearing thin on them, and they've been clamoring for a return to previous continents. And I can't necessarily say I blame them from a certain point of view. The reason that some hate this continent with a passion is the exact same reason some have loved it. Oshur is a completely different beast when you compare it to all the other continents we've had in the game previously. It's the only continent we've ever seen in the game that has been built from the ground up with the construction system in mind and as a feature in the game. And that in turn has created a pretty unique battle flow that has encouraged a very different style of gameplay, and pace of gameplay for that matter. The continent has plenty of larger, open field style territories with little development placed structures, and in turn, very little in the way of hard spawns. On top of that, the entire layout of the lattice, along with the way the environment design works with the lattice, creates massive snowballing effects on population. You see a lot more forces just slowly building to a critical mass to plow through bases in quick succession. And this stays true for longer than other continents in my opinion thanks to the level design. The islands and the presence of water everywhere drives forces down narrow paths even when additional lattice links exist, because some of those lattice links are just simply harder to traverse than other ones. Now, this can obviously create a bit of an issue. If a force of equal strength doesn't come to match that of an enemy force almost immediately, well then, well, anyone caught on the receiving end of this, massive Zerg that's reached this critical mass is going to have a really bad time. It creates frustrating gameplay that just sees people avoid the fight completely because, well, why get farmed by a force that dwarfs your own? Why would you succumb yourself to that if no one else is going to do it as well? So this can create ghost capping Zergs that everyone ignores until they have no choice not to. And I've seen that happen on plenty of occasions, and it's not healthy for the flow of the continent. However, I've also seen the opposite happen. When you have an equal force decide to fall back to the previous hex or two and pull a large enough force to try and counter that attacking Zerg, and well, that's when the continent kinda comes alive in its own right. The armor fights on this continent in particular are the best this game has to offer. There is no denying that. As someone myself who loves a good bit of meaningful vehicle-on-vehicle gameplay, I've been thoroughly enjoying that side of Oshur. I specifically remember being on stream this past weekend and spawning into a construction base that was under a massive Vanu sovereignty siege. So me, being the overly optimistic sod that I am, decided to go back a few bases and pull a vanguard to see if I could, take a few of the bastards with me. I was greeted by a massive NC armor column that was forming up to take on that force, and the ensuing battle across multiple bases was, in my opinion, some of the most fun I've had in the game for a long time from the perspective of armor. But I also have to say, even fighting as an infantry player on these more open open field fights can have its moments of novelty and enjoyment. It really took me back to the Shattered Warp Gate days when that update first dropped and everyone was fighting in that northeastern region. It felt very different to the quintessential Planetside experience that we've had since the launch of the game, and I was able to find enjoyment in that and make some of those battles come to me as a player. But in order for that new gameplay to emerge and to become the forefront of the experience on Oshur, you need to sacrifice something else to make that room for that to exist. And well, the amount of bases that can house confined infantry fighting, where your outfits that focus on point holding or being particularly skilled in the infantry game, they've got less spaces to play in. And unfortunately, the spaces that are here that do try to cater to that style of play are not RPG's best work yet. Now, I have to say, despite this, there are some spaces that I have enjoyed fighting in and around that are your more infantry-focused environments. For example, Century Mining Operation, Sage R&D Labs, Pommel Cliffs, and the last one may surprise people, but hear me out, Trident Facilities. I've actually had great little skirmishes at these bases. When the fights are even and the force multiplier spam is low, infantry can have great little skirmishes at these fights, and I genuinely believe that there is room for those good infantry fights to exist on the continent when the population doesn't go overboard. At Tridents in particular, I think there's great room for fun infantry engagements in a base that offers some interesting areas for fights. But unfortunately, the criteria for those bases to work, the population levels, the force multiplier spam, stuff like that, doesn't often come to a head. Due to the encouraged gameplay that comes from these long strings of open air territories and the snowballing effect that comes as a result as forces pick up steam, the continent's dev-built bases get slammed as one of these forces reaches them. Choke points become majorly contested, and because a lot of vehicles are in the mess, spawns often end up either being spawn camped on the defender's side really quickly, or attackers just get their spawns wiped out in the form of sun deployments. Century Mining is a base that I have had the opportunity to fight at on multiple occasions, but the fights last nowhere near as long as I would like them to, which is a shame because the spawns always get sniped. I've also very rarely had the chance to make it out from the spawn room at Sage R&D as a defender as well because, well, it just gets hit by every form of force multiplier spam under the sun as soon as a force reaches it. I remember when I first looked at this continent on the test server, and I made a pretty big point about how spawn rooms seemed to be relatively covered from vehicle interference to hopefully result in clean infantry fighting areas. And well, turns out that isn't exactly how this works on this continent after a little bit of playtesting. The majority of the dev play spaces use the same assets that we've seen on other continents to this day, and we've already confirmed that when you jam anything above 48 players a team into these play spaces, things can get pretty stagnant pretty quickly. So if you do get into a fight that gets past spawn camping or spawn sniping, fights at these bases for the most part are really prone to just turning into stagnant fights really quickly. And not in a good way where you have infantry rotating between capture points in a back and forth manner. No. Sadly, more like in the sense where you have 96 plus aside, looking at either end of a corridor or a hallway or a corner, who can just see who can fling the most explosives each other's way. Even the new facility types, interlinks in particular, are a big issue on this front, but we have more on those to share later. Now, of course, you could up the scale of these bases to accommodate the sizes of the forces that the continent encourages. But then the big old catch-22 of that is that the smaller outfits that pride themselves on tight-knit point holds against all odds, well, then they lose all ability to have any sense of impact. So the end result is a continent that doesn't really work for a certain group of players no matter what you do here. And in the ecosystem of Planetside, that is something that you are potentially going to hit regardless. Even after the lattice is worked on, and even after the bases are refined to ensure less spawn camps happen, no matter what, this continent is built with larger groups of players in mind. And it explains the polarizing response we have seen from the community around this continent. You take time to appease one camp, you immediately take away from the other. I genuinely think that when you look past the bugs, Oshur is behaving as a continent how it was intended to, minus some of the glaring issues in the base design that hold back its ability to accommodate these forces, which will be worked on over time. But the way I look at Oshur, it's a very good chance that for that exact reason, Oshur could become the next Hossen in the sense that some love the continent and some log out as soon as it comes up in the rotation. I'm almost willing to bet that the two camps are the same players between Hossen and Oshur, only that they have the opposite reaction to each continent depending. As it stands, I'm enjoying the newness of the continent, I'm enjoying the newness of Oshur, but I do wonder whether or not the different flow will grow old on me. Once the continent finds its way into the rotation as opposed to being unlocked 24/7, then maybe it'll be a nice change of pace we go through every once in a while, we'll see. But I don't necessarily think this is going to be everyone's cup of tea, and while there are some clear design errors that need to be worked on here, I don't necessarily think this is a content that is designed to appease to everyone. Now, that's not to say I'm falling onto the side of, if you don't like combined arms warfare, then you should go play COD. No, that's not what's going on here. Because I do believe that the infantry combat of this game is incredibly interesting, and when it's done right, it can be one of the most rewarding aspects of the game to play, just hands down. But Oshur is clearly aiming to achieve something a little bit different here. For some players, that's going to be a turn-off, but I don't necessarily think that's the worst thing in the world. It just means that other continents could then become something different and could, hone in on different experiences as well that maybe the combined arms population of the player base won't enjoy as much, but the infantry-centric player base will enjoy more. For example, I really think we could amp up Hossen and make it more of an infantry-focused environment as well to give infantry that domain where they are really dominant. We'll see what happens. Now, work is already being done to improve Oshur based on the feedback in question. I mentioned earlier that interlink facilities are in a pretty rough state as it is, with the spawn room hallway becoming just an absolute kill zone for defenders far too quickly. There's 6 of these things on the continent, so the fact that they're not performing too well as it is, it's not great. Shockter on his live stream, which I really recommend checking out by the way, there's a link in the description down below. He's the guy who ran the epic Speedrunners tournament that just wrapped up its 2nd season and is easily one of the most enjoyable competitive formats to watch for this game. But yeah, he made a very good point of how busted interlinks are right now by kind of going to, I think it was 3 interlink fights back to back and saying that he had, quote, not seen the capture point yet, unquote, which was, yeah, about the best way I think I could have put it. But Rel has of late made a tweet stating that he is looking at the interlinks and looking to make some improvements, such as more cover against air, interior changes to get players out of the spawn room hallway, bollards in the entrance, snipers perch on the top floor to clear the rooftop more easily, and teleporters where they can be squeezed in, which is all good news. I hope we can continue making improvements to the continent to make it flow a bit better how it intends to flow. Now that's all I really have to say about Oshur, but there is one more thing that I need to bring up here in today's video, and that is the spawn system that got changed in the latest update. I've got to be real, guys, and I've got to be a bit crass here. The latest update just feels sluggish as shit to me. I'm still trying to work out exactly what the new logic is behind this spawn system, but the big thing that has stuck out to me is that spawns across the board, if you're in the same hex for that matter, seem to have been increased to a 15-second flat respawn timer for things like sunderers and spawn rooms. I don't know why this has been made. I really don't. The game has been slowed down for what appears to be no reason in my opinion. It makes cheesy deaths such as shotguns, air to ground, Hesh, max units, all that stuff just feel even more frustrating to go against, and dying freshly off of a respawn is not a fun time, which happens a lot on Oshur. If I spawn in an open field fight on a sunderer and I get clapped by a sniper or a flail cannon, which has been running dominant lately, it just makes the game feel sluggish and unrewarding to play if you happen to die to one of these cheesy deaths, even more so than what it was beforehand. I just can't seem to work out why this was done. It just makes the game more punishing to play and less fun to play for me. Like, I find it harder to get into a rhythm, I find it harder to get back into a fight, and if a faction now gets that sort of, that critical mass going where they can just steamroll what is ahead of them, then that becomes even more accented by a slower respawn time for all of the defenders that are on the receiving end of that. It accents spawn camps, it just makes these snowballs, I don't like the change at all, guys. It slows down the game far too much for me to enjoy. The game doesn't need to become slower. That's the opposite of what Planetside 2 needs, in my opinion. It's not a mil-sim shooter. It's not a tactical shooter. It's a first-person shooter with some larger scale territory meta involved. And I think that needs to be accented, and I think slowing down the game takes away from the experience, in my personal opinion. I've heard a lot of people claim that this makes combat medics more meaningful. I hate to break it to you guys, they didn't need to be more meaningful. Combat medics were already such a weight and such a power on the battlefield before this respawn timer change happened. We really don't need to slow down the game and make the game more frustrating to play just to make combat medics more meaningful. There are other ways we can do that for medics without hurting the rest of the game. But guys, with all of that said, that's going to wrap up today's video talking about Oshur at its release. We didn't go over the entire list of patch notes here because, quite frankly, there's just too much to go over, and well, it's not worth it at this stage. You guys can read patch notes. I want to focus on going over my observations and what I think the continent is trying to do based on my time on it. If you guys enjoyed today's video, backhand the like button. It goes a long way to supporting the channel, and if you're new here, consider subscribing. It goes a long way to supporting the content, and it means you get to stay up to date with whenever we release a future video in the long run, and whenever we go live here on the YouTube channel as well. Feel free to check out all my social media links down below as well, guys, and as always, I hope you guys enjoyed today's video. Peace out, and I will see you guys all in the next one. Take care, guys. Have a good one.